Ryan was on the radio station and said he didn't support it because it was permanent. You know who else said that? Ted Cruz from Texas. Ted Cruz said, he's holding this up, this piece of legislation in the Senate that Senator Tester and Senator Walsh are trying to pass. But I support fair trade. And we need to find markets for our beef and wheat and other commodities in Montana, no question about that. But if I'm fortunate enough to serve, I will take a case-by-case approach with free trade agreements, and I will ask, does this trade agreement create jobs in America, and is it good for Montana?
Ms. Yamanaka.
Mr. Lewis, in Billings and in many of the Bakken-affected communities, the unemployment rate is around 3%. But this isn't the case on the reservations. And I look at the Fort Peck Reservation as an example. It's close to the Bakken, where there's an unemployment rate of over 53% among tribal members. Why do you think this is the case? And what are the challenges of improving employment on the reservations?
Sure. Well, first of all, in Indian country, we need to invest in education and workforce development, just like we need to in all of rural America, in rural Montana. And that will give people the skills necessary to fill jobs so we can drive down unemployment in Indian country. What's going on in Fort Peck and northeast Montana is, frankly, that development and the lack of law enforcement infrastructure has allowed for influx of drug dealers and bad people, frankly, that have come in there, and especially on the reservation, and dealing things like meth and heroin. And we don't have the resources to deal with that crime right now. And jails are full, and we need to invest in that if we're going to have this development and if it's going to be done the right way.
Mr. ZINKE.
Well, I agree that education is important. I also look at Indian nations as sovereign. And if you want to see bureaucracy, take a look at the Bureau of Indian Affairs and what they've dealt with for generations. No one understands the yoke of government more than the Indian nations. In the case of the Crow, they can't get to their coal. Can you imagine what happens if the coal is taken out or they can't use it in the Crow Agency? Hundreds of jobs. The Blackfoot, struggling with oil. So we do need to help our neighbors. We need to make sure that they don't have an encumbered in bureaucracy that isn't streamlined, that doesn't allow them what's right to be a sovereign nation, what's right to be good neighbors, fellow Montanans and Americans.
Mr. Johnson.
Senator ZINKE, you've said you support the framework of the Ryan budget, which passed the House this spring. It would create a voucher system to replace Medicare and pay benefits on a sliding scale based on income. Do you support that?
No, I don't. And even though my opponent constantly says that I support, cutting Medicaid and cutting Social Security, and I hate children and education and puppies. It's not true. I think America needs to keep the promises we made. We made promises to our veterans. We made promises to our elderly. We made promises to those on Medicare, those who are disabled. And we need to honor those promises. Can we deliver those promises better? Yeah, I think so. Medicare Advantage was one of them. But when you take $720 billion and you transfer it from Medicaid to Obamacare, is that saving Medicare? No. I think we can do better. See, when you look at it, it goes back to being prosperous. Medicare is expensive. We know it. But you know what's not expensive? Is running our economy where people have jobs.
Mr. Lewis.
Well, first of all, he said that the Ryan budget isn't just a framework. It isn't as aggressive as he would like. And I want to clarify something on this $716 billion in cuts in Medicare. That was in the Affordable Care Act. There were no cuts to senior benefits in the Affordable Care Act. That $716 billion in that piece of legislation was to cut out waste, fraud, and unwarranted payments to insurance companies and providers. And what did it do? Cutting out that waste extended the life of the Medicare Trust Fund until 2024. And here's the irony of that. That $716 billion, that same $716 billion was so good that it was included in the Paul Ryan budget that my opponent supports. The only problem is the Paul Ryan budget takes it one step further and turns Medicare into a voucher system, cutting billions in benefits from Medicare beneficiaries. And don't take my word for it, take the word of an independent organization like AARP, who says the Ryan budget will destroy Medicare.
It's one thing to talk about cutting government spending, and yet we're in a state that they're receiving more government funding than it actually pays in taxes. And I'd like you to name at least one thing specific to Montana that you would be willing to cut. I mean, you could look at your constituents and say, I'm sorry, but I'm pulling the plug on this one.
That's a good question, Tom, and you're not going to let us off the hook on this one, I can tell. Look, there's no question that there is waste in things like the Farm Bill, the Highway Bill, and other massive pieces of legislation that Montana benefits greatly from. And yeah, we need to find that waste in those pieces of legislation. And of course, it's not to serve, I will look for that waste. And it shouldn't be a free-for-all where we're just throwing money at rural areas. But you cut me off. So, not naming anything specific, we need to cut out wasteful spending.
Mr. Zinke.
Well, I think the $3.4 billion set aside for Common Core should be cut. Education is a local issue. I think we can do education a lot better. And education matters because education and jobs. I was a ward, a rural school association legislative leader. I care about kids. I care about education. There's better ways to deliver it than a one-size-fits-all from Washington that doesn't match the expectations of local communities or kids.
Mr. Lewis, I'd like to ask you a follow-up on that. Mr. Zinke said cut Common Core. What is your stance on Common Core?
Well, we have Common Core because of a top-down approach that we have from the No Child Left Behind legislation. And I think we're actually making it work pretty well here in Montana. You look at what Denise teachers are doing in Montana, they're making it work. I mean, just ask Denise, ask Eric. Is it perfect? No. But we're actually making it work better than any other states, Common Core in Montana.
This is the last question. I wanted to ask if you would support the return of congressional earmarks to support infrastructure projects that we've been talking about tonight.
That one would go to Mr. Zinke.
You know, it's interesting. Congress got rid of earmarks and thought they were saving money. Then what happened is the administration has earmarks in the form of grants. Billions of dollars of grants. So I think I'm kind of a little happy between. I think Congress should have a say on spending money. That means if you're going to give a grant and the grant is over a threshold, I think Congress should have a say to make sure that grant is going not for who has more political clout, but for the right reasons. So I don't like earmarks because it creates a political environment where it's this versus that, and it corrupts our system. Things need to live on merit, and merit alone. On both sides, both the executive and the Congress. In many cases, the Congress has lost our authority. And there's whole organizations that Congress no longer has any say about building $1.2 million buildings or $20 million buildings. Or in the case, I'll stop. I can go on.
I trust you can. Mr. Lewis.
I actually agree on that point, and it's that Congress is not legislative. They don't pass legislation. So many of the decisions are passed over to the executive branch, government agencies that have never been to the city of Montana, have never been to Missoula, Montana, any place in the rural parts of the state. So while not advocating for the return of earmarks, there's no question that it has caused some of the dysfunction in Congress because Congress is not working together. It's all passed the executive branch, executive agencies that frankly don't know what's best for Montana.
Okay, well, we said it's the last question, but we're going to add one more curveball, and Mr. Lewis, just because it's your turn. One issue that you believe you might agree with Mr. ZINKE on, and Mr. ZINKE, same question about Mr. Lewis. So, one issue out there that you two might agree on.
Ooh, well, that last issue, for one, that may not count, but then we can come up with two. We both agreed that Congress is not getting the job done. And we also need to do something about the deficit in this country. On so many issues, whether it's immigration, deficit, energy, all of these issues are being kicked down the road for future generations. And we need to do a better job in Congress working together on these issues. And I think we agree on that concept. I don't know what specific issues that we're going to come together on here, but it's a good question.
Thanks. Mr. ZINKE.
I think families. John has a wonderful family, and so do I. And I think what we want both is to make sure our families prosper, that our kids grow up in the same environment with the legacy that we inherited from our fathers. So I think on families and the importance of families and the importance of making sure that the families are protected, violence against women, and those issues, I think John and I agree.
That concludes the U.S.